we are in the condition we are in the state of ignorance we are in the state of war, in the state of economic depression, in the state of depletion of the resources of our planet because of the greed of psychopaths who thought they could create their own reality. Well, look at the reality they created.
You're listening to Behind the Headlines on the Sott Radio Network. The world for people who think.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Behind the Headlines. I'm Neil Bradley and my co-host as usual, Joe Quinn. Hi there. This week we're speaking with a very special guest. He's author and editor Robin Ramsay. Robin has been editor and publisher of Lobster magazine since it first appeared in 1983. He has also written a number of books, including Prawn Cocktail Party, The Hidden Power of New Labour, and Who Shot JFK. Robin was also co-author of the book Smear, Wilson and the Secret State. For some 10 years, Robin also wrote a column in the Fortean Times magazine on conspiracy theories. You may have heard of Lobster magazine. If you haven't, it's a superb magazine. It's been going for some 32 years now. It's had all kinds of contributors, academics, journalists, and is today still published twice annually. The magazine focuses primarily on deep politics, parapolitics. That's the influence of intelligence and security services on politics and world trade. You should definitely check it out. Its website is lobster-magazine.co.uk. We're delighted that Robin is joining us today. So a very warm welcome to you, Robin.
Hello, good evening.
Yeah, Robin, it's I've been aware of your magazine, of Lobster magazine, for a long time. Just one question: has it ever been in print?
It began as a print magazine. It began in 1983. It was a long time ago, before computers, at least before people like me could afford computers.
Uh-huh.
So it was originally done in the old-fashioned way with, typewriters and gum and pasting up bits of paper in columns, and offset litho printing, and the original edition was 150 copies. And it was a print magazine, hard copy, until issue 57, I think, when it suddenly seemed absurd to be mithering about with, mountains of paper when I could leave it on a website and it could be seen by anybody. It could be seen for nothing, but by anybody that wanted to log onto it and see it. And it saved me a lot of work. Producing a magazine single-handed is an incredible chore.
Yeah, we kind of know that we produced a magazine for a while ourselves, just a couple of years, and then give it up because it was just too much work, And also not a lot of people. I mean, the reach of a magazine compared to the net is just these days it's very difficult to get hard copy of magazines under people's noses. When everybody's sitting at the computer.
My own view now is I should have gone online 5 years before. My view now is if you want to have some people to read things, put it online. Messing about with paper is a complete waste of time nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Robin, just to get, I have a question here, just to kind of maybe get straight into the topic. Your research and writing, over the many years you've been doing it, has focused on, I think, what you called, I saw it in the latest edition of Lobster. It focuses on the surface world of politics and the covert world of politics. So, if it's not too difficult to do it, could you describe the difference between those two?
Well, that's interesting. I'm never sure. Lobster's focus has shifted. My own focus has shifted. I haven't been staring at the same patch of dirt for 30 whatever years. I began. You have to go back a long way. I approached British politics, having got interested in American politics, and then having got interested in American parapolitics, the term invented by Peter Dale Scott. Peter Dale Scott was very important to me. Peter Dale Scott, produced that nice term. Also, Peter Dale Scott showed me how to do research. He showed me how to write it. And from the very first issue of the magazine, it was very important to me that if I was going to say something, there had to be evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So Lobster is full of citations. There's hardly anything in Lobster that hasn't got a citation attached to it, a footnote. So that was the important. Now, Peter Dale Scott was interested in parapolitics, and I began in a sense as a kind of naive Kennedy conspiracy buff in the 70s. And then it occurred to me, and then if you follow the Kennedy thing, you're into the CIA, post-war history, the Cold War, you're into media manipulation, you're into all this stuff. And it began to dawn on me that you could start looking at British politics through the same set of eyes. It was much more difficult to do here because there were many fewer sources. Britain in those days, certainly, and still is, I think, a much more closed society. Even in the 70s, even in the 70s, in the days of hard copy print, America had a much bigger underground news world than Britain ever did. So I began by, as it were, looking at the Labour left, for example, and why it failed through the eyes of somebody who had studied the CIA first, which was a strange perspective. At the time.
Right, and it was a strange perspective. I mean, you still write quite a lot about, or you still focus in your Lobster magazine. You still focus on the JFK assassination as new kind of the odd new detail might come up.
Sure.
And but I mean, what's your? I think I know what your take on the JFK assassination is, but it's pretty mainstream, right? Mainstream conspiracy theory, let's say.
I would say it's a minority view within the Kennedy assassination buff world. It's not a popular view at all. The thing about I now think it's pretty clearly been demonstrated now that in fact this huge event, and the Kennedy assassination was an enormous event. We got another 50 years of Cold War after that, because Kennedy and Khrushchev were trying to wind the Cold War down.
Right.
So when Kennedy got killed and then Khrushchev was overthrown, we then got more bloody Cold War. We still got more Cold War because there's a third Cold War being generated in the Ukraine and Eastern Europe and Estonia by the Americans again. But I think Kennedy was killed through simple, banal domestic politics. His deputy, Vice President Johnson, was about to be done for corruption. A lot of people had given Johnson a lot of money in the previous 20 years, 30 years, 20 years. And they were all going to go down the pan. And the only way they could work out to prevent this, and this was being driven by the Kennedys. The Kennedys themselves wanted Johnson off the ticket for the 1964 election. They wanted to dump Johnson. And they were letting this investigation of him by the Justice Department go ahead. Johnson was about to get prosecuted and dumped. And the only way they could see how to prevent this was to make Johnson the president. As soon as he became president, all the inquiries ended. So in that sense, the Kennedy buff world, the big Kennedy buff world, the serious people, the people who spent their lives in it, and I'm just a dabbler by their standards, they don't like this idea. It's not big enough. They wanted to be something much bigger than this. It was just about money and careers. And that is profoundly unsatisfying to most of the Kennedy buffs who think it must be the CIA and geopolitics or Vietnam or something really big. It was just boring old American corruption.
Okay, but then just to bring it back to the point you first raised, that then is followed by a second Cold War, a renewal of it. This is then a kind of a happy coincidence for certain players in the U.S. establishment.
Sure.
So that's more coincidental, an alignment of interest.
Well, the question that would bring up that angle that you're promoting, Robin, is that that was the Johnson gang were kind of unique to a large extent in U.S. politics, and that there haven't been many other people who are high up in the U.S. kind of political world who, being faced with being ousted, would orchestrate an assassination against the president. That's why people, I think that there might have been something else behind it, because that's a bit of an extreme approach to take to the thought of you being ditched. Surely Johnson's people could have just sided with the next guy type thing, or sided with Kennedy.
Excuse me. Yes, it was a very unusual event, but then Johnson, to my knowledge, and I haven't Obviously I haven't read everything, and the literature on this is now vast. But to my knowledge, Johnson was the only major American politician who was actually running his own crime unit. I mean, his own criminal gang. Essentially, he was head of a criminal gang in Texas. Excuse me. And that's unusual. Lots of American politicians are corrupt. I mean, most of them, I would guess, are corrupt in the sense they take huge amounts of money from people to whom they owe favors, which I would define as corruption. The Americans don't see it that way. They just see this is how politics is played.
Yeah.
But Johnson was unusual. His gang in Texas actually had a gunman on their staff who bumped people off periodically, 7 or 8 that we're pretty sure of.
Right.
Going back to 1951. It's difficult now to recreate the world in which LBJ was operating, the world of Texas in the 1950s. It was a very, very long way away from Washington. And it was extremely. It was only 80 years since the Alamo. You know, I mean, there were people alive in Dallas and Johnson was there who remembered who'd been at the Alamo, for God's sake. So it was the Wild West with that kind of mentality, and they just shot people. And they just happened to shoot the president as well. But they didn't see it as a big deal, that big a deal to them. He was just another bad politician as far as they were concerned. He was just another politician, one of them. But yes, a big event. And I'm afraid I am still interested in it, even though hardly anybody else is.
Yeah, well, it's been a long time and a lot has been said about it. I mean, you can forgive people for just walking away from it at this stage, but
yawning and moving on to the next space.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm never surprised or insulted if people say I don't care about JFK. It's too far away.
Yeah, or
Absolutely.
even people who say, yeah, he was assassinated, but yeah, it's a long time ago, and what are you going to do? We've got bigger problems right now anyway.
Absolutely.
That kind of brings me into what I was going to say. What you mentioned about so you got interested in the JFK assassination, but then you moved into kind of started looking at British politics and the Labour government and stuff. And I think, was it fairly quickly that you started to see some, unlike in the US and JFK, you started to see some evidence of intelligence agency involvement in the politics in the UK?
That didn't really happen until the middle 80s. So there was a period from sort of 76 to 86, really, where there was very little material of that kind available. There were bits and pieces coming out of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland in the 70s and still into the 80s was where the British secret state and the military were most active. I mean, there were dribs and drabs coming from historians about the empire, but insofar as we knew anything much about the organization of the British secret state, it was through looking at events in Northern Ireland. And in the late 70s, there was hardly anything. There was one book by Tony Bunyan called The Political Police in Britain, in which he pulled together all the little fragments that were then extant about special branch and surveillance, and none of this stuff existed really before the late 70s. When Duncan Campbell, for example, produced the first articles about GCHQ, before his articles, I don't think anybody in Britain, or especially in Parliament, had any idea that GCHQ existed, let alone what it did. This is all pretty recent, all this. But the stuff about the intelligence services and about the events against Wilson, happened really from the mid-80s onwards, and to a very large extent were triggered by my connecting up with Colin Wallace. It was Wallace who pointed me in that direction, and of course, having been given the appropriate steer, as it were, I went back to the library and began looking at a different set of literature and discovered there was a whole bunch of stuff there that I hadn't noticed before.
So that kind of makes the point that when you mention Harold Wilson, the former British Prime Minister, you mentioned that there's books out there, and you've done a lot of writing and research on the plot against Wilson. So, and that was a British intelligence agency plot to get rid of as sitting Prime Minister. That wasn't a mafia kind of corporate mob type thing.
It was. It's now difficult to believe this, but in the early 1970s, MI5, which is the British version of the FBI, which was in touch with a faction or a fraction of the CIA, the counterintelligence people led by James Angleton, The Angleton's people were telling MI5 that Wilson was a communist agent.
Yeah.
Angleton's people were being told this by a Soviet defector who was mad, but that's a digression. So a section of MI5 believed this. Most of MI5, I suspect, didn't believe this because they'd met Wilson, but they believed there was a communist plot to take over the Labour Party and then the government. So in the 1972-3, we had a conservative government in power led by Edward Heath. There were considerable kind of underground machinations by a group of MI5 officers, some in the military, some in MI6, but mostly MI5, who believed, and as far as I can tell, genuinely believed, based on their sources in the CIA, that there was a real-life, honest-to-God KGB conspiracy to seize control in Britain. This, of course, to anybody who's then on the left, or close to the left, as I had been most of my life, was absolutely hysterically funny. Because the idea that the British Communist Party could take over anything was a joke. The British Communist Party in 1973 had, I don't know, 10,000 members maybe, of whom 2,000 were working for MI5 probably, because as we now know, MI5 completely infiltrated the Communist Party just as the FBI had done in America with the CPUSA. So to a very large extent, the Communist Party in Britain was being run by MI5, funded by MI5 and propped up by MI5. But so this theory was there. Wilson is a communist, and the KGB are running the trade unions, and the trade unions run the Labour Party, and if we don't stop them, we'll have East Germany. But they genuinely believed, I think, that Britain was on the verge of becoming East Germany and falling into the Soviet orbit, which of course was of considerable interest to the Americans, because this was the Cold War still. That was the background to all the stuff that was going on in the 70s. All these machinations and smear stories and burglaries and surveillance and bugging and, the usual stuff.
Yeah, so just to be clear, you think that at that time MI5 did actually, the top tier of MI5 did believe, or MI6 did believe that there was a communist plot around Wilson?
Some of them, not all. It was a split. These organizations are not homogeneous.
Right.
They're not uniform. They've got factions and camps within them. It's not a straight down, hierarchical top down thing. So there was a section of MI5 F branch chiefly, in which these notions resided. The people in F branch believed they were dealing with a serious communist threat because the left was on the rise. The unions were on the rise. The miners' workers had defeated the Heath government in 1972. The Labour left, which had some communist sympathizers, communist fellow travellers, they were on the rise in the party. The party was moving left. There was no question about this. But it's one thing to say the Labour Party was moving left. It's not something else to say, and the KGB is controlling it. Of the KGB's control, there never was any evidence, and nobody's ever produced any. And now that when the wall fell in '89, when the Berlin Wall fell in '89, and we got this torrent of people from the Eastern Bloc came to the West, and they were asked, where are you running the Communist Party of Great Britain? Of course, what that produced was gales of laughter. They thought it was a ridiculous idea. Basically, as if only. But that's what they believe. Now, it's not difficult to understand why. We are all trapped in our own perceptions. We're all trapped in our own theories. We all screen things out that we don't want to see. We all suffer from what's it called?
Cognitive dissonance?
Cognitive dissonance is an expression about confirmation.
Confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias. That's in the last 10. It's a very, very, very useful expression. One has to work terribly hard not to be completely paralyzed by confirmation bias. And in the 70s, MI5 and bits of 6 and bits of the Army were completely, and the IRD, of course, the Information Research Department, which studies this, they were all suffering from a major case of confirmation bias. And they saw everything through the eyes of this communist conspiracy theory, which leads me, if I may continue rambling on, to one of those interesting things. We're now living in the golden age of conspiracy theory, this endless endless stories in the major media now sneering at conspiracy theories. Oh, lunatics. The big conspiracy theories in my 30 years ago, 40 years ago, were all coming from the security services, and they were all about the KGB. In 1972, the only conspiracy theories you could find in Britain were two kinds. One was the stuff coming through the Daily Telegraph from MI5 about the communists running the unions, and the other would have been on the far right about the usual Jewish conspiracy theory, which still existed in Britain on the far right. There were no other conspiracy theories of any kind in this country. I mean, you never saw them. They just weren't there.
Mm-hmm.
I'll stop.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, very often, I mean, the first person to call a conspiracy theory, it comes from some authoritative source, and it's kind of like a blanket projection onto anything.
Very important point. Projection is the key. What you had in Britain was a bunch of people who were professionally engaged in conspiracy. IRD, MI5, MI6, special branches. These are all professional. These are people whose job was to conspire. In their case, to conspire to penetrate the left. But they were all conspiratorially minded completely, and they projected like mad. They projected their view of the world onto us, and never bothered to check whether any of it was true. So confirmation, but excuse me, that's my virus talking. Confirmation bias and projection are the two big problems that we all suffer from if we're trying to make sense of all this vast field of data that we now have to play with.
Yeah. Okay, so let me see. Maybe this question doesn't really have an answer, but when you say confirmation bias, what kind of bias were these people in the establishment? Because a lot of people who go into MI5 and MI6 and the intelligence agencies are, you know, they're a particular type. At least they were maybe 30 or 40 years ago. So what kind of bias or what kind of ideology do these people hold to that would, was it simply us versus them kind of thing, or was there any kind of what was their ideology? What is the ideology of the intelligence services?
Well, of course, there was no single ideology. But as far as I can tell, centrally they believed, excuse me, that they were on the good. Excuse me.
No problem.
That there was a global struggle between the forces of darkness, i.e. the Reds, the commies, and the forces of light, i.e. Western Europe, America, progress, democracy. I mean, I know you had Bill Bloom on, and even Toltec the same things about America. This is what they believed. They believed they were the good guys fighting the bad guys. It was white hats and black hats.
Mm-hmm.
There used to be a column in Mad magazine called Spy versus Spy back in the 60s. And there was a bunch of spies wearing white hats and a bunch of spies wearing black hats.
Right.
And they ran around blowing each other up and shooting each other. And that's all it was. But in Britain, in MI5 and MI6, there are distinctions to be drawn there. But roughly speaking, they thought they were the good guys. Lots of them were, I would describe them as well-intentioned but naive patriots. They were patriotic. They believed the queen and country, free market, capitalism, home-owning democracy, the mother of parliament, houses of parliament, and that was the way forward. That was the way into the light. And anybody who opposed that, anybody who suggested, for example, that maybe privately owning news production wasn't such a good idea, was a bad guy.
So, would it be fair to say that these people in the intelligence agencies kind of had this view that they were the guardians of all things British, let's say, and that you couldn't trust the politicians because they could be infiltrated or they could be left-wingers or commies or stuff.
Exactly.
But you have an old guard in the intelligence agencies who are, kind of colonial mindset maybe, or from that, and they were there to...
MI5, certainly a lot of MI5 officers after the war were recruited from the Empire. And that's certainly true of MI5. MI5 saw themselves as the guardians of British society. And I can't remember what their slogan is, but their slogan, their motto, is something about guardians. MI6 is a more subtle. They're not nearly. MI6 basically were brighter than MI5, and they were much more recruited from the upper classes. The MI5 were often recruited from what we might call the middle orders. MI6 was, the elite of the elite, and they recruited very largely from Oxbridge and at the higher echelon. And there are some very, very bright people there, very bright people. And they didn't have this naive, most of them anyway, didn't have this simple-minded, patriotic view of the world. They knew they were engaged in a struggle, but they also knew that the KGB people they were working against were rather like them. I mean, the KGB was the elite of Soviet society, just as MI6 at some level was bits of MI6 certainly, were the elite of British society.
Right.
And not for nothing was it called the Great Game. And they never killed each other. I mean, people in MI6 didn't go around shooting KGB people, and vice versa. It simply was a game, a very interesting game, and not terribly well paid, but you got your reward, you got your OBE or whatever, or your CK, CNG, and you got a decent pension at the end of it. But it was a game. In MI5 and IRD and the military people that took all this stuff seriously were simply making a mistake. And I think there's odd bits of evidence now that when it came to it, one of Harold Wilson, Prime Minister Wilson's major sources, one of the people who was telling him what was going on was Maurice Oldfield, who was at the time, I think he was the deputy chief of MI6. So Wilson was being persecuted by these nutters and fools in MI5, and MI6, the MI6 chief was having an occasional meeting and saying, listen, old boy, don't worry about it. We know it's not like that, really. And by the way, look at this and look at that. And that's one of the causes of the intense rivalry between MI5 and MI6, which used to exist and may still exist.
So that a lot of stuff that the intelligence agencies did during the Cold War was justified by the Cold War and the communist threat and the us versus them ideologies and stuff. And they could have it could be, let's say, excused then for believing that, and they were misguided but well-intentioned people. But now that there is no Soviet threat anymore, there's no commie threat. Why are intelligence agencies still taking the same kind of approach to? I mean, what has it shifted to? What is the potential dissent in British society today that these same people have to fight against?
Well, that's very interesting, because what you saw when I was following this when the war went down in 1990 and the Soviet bloc collapsed, you could see MI6 particularly, because their brief just went beyond. Their brief was the world, but MI5 in particular was scrambling around trying to find enemies. Right. And at one point, they made a big push to try and get their hands on the drug traffic business, because that's all there was. Right. I mean, this is before radical Islam. Now, along comes radical Islam just in the nick of time. The MI5 and all these couriers, they're all saved now. They've got a real enemy again. Yeah. But there was a period from 90 to say 90 to 99, really, when MI5 really had almost nothing to do, because there was still stuff going on in Ireland. But then when the Blair government did the Belfast Agreement and wound all that down as well, then there was the prospect that MI5 really had almost nothing to do. But then, of course, radical Islam came along, and people have made all kinds of claims that the intelligence services generated it on purpose, which I personally don't believe. But you can see why you might think that, because
it's coincidental for sure.
Very coincidental, a very interesting coincidence for sure. And I think you could certainly make a better case for saying that the American military-industrial complex certainly needed enemies after the Cold War, and they certainly were very happy to have the Middle East go up in smoke and produce a whole generation of enemies for whom they would lead more and more and bigger and better weapons.
Well,
I mean, a lot of it is, especially the Americans. Britain is such a small player now; it hardly matters. But certainly with the Americans, a lot of it is simply as banal as this. Big American corporations that make weapons need enemies, and by God, they get them.
Yeah. So you're talking really here about someone who's or an organization whose existence is based on the presence of an enemy, of having an enemy to fight against, and I mean certainly that's coming from the Cold War. You can see how those intelligence agencies in the US and the UK and Europe kind of grew and became what they are today, on the basis of that communist threat. The communist threat goes away, they're not going to just pack up their bags and leave, right? They need to find something to do. So, and it's interesting because that's a very, that's a very broad but a very true, I think, explanation of the kind of divide we see in the last 10, maybe 5-10 years with this kind of new Cold War, the third Cold War that you described. Because it seems to me that the US in particular and the UK is continuing to look and even trying to, as you said in your recent Lobster edition, they're investing in enemies to kind of, because they need them for their existence. But Russia, on the other hand, seems to be kind of coming at it from the opposite direction, where Russia seems to need not maybe justify its existence, but to bolster its own existence and strengthen its own position. It needs friends. It seems to be pushing in the opposite direction in terms of trying to solve conflicts and deal with these problems, and that's very much antagonistic, I think, towards what the US and the Brits, for example, are based on,
Yes, no, you're right. That's absolutely true. But having said that, of course, within the existing Russian Federation, there is an arms lobby. There are military people. There are soldiers and missile designers and all the rest of it, and they're very happy to have the Cold War up and running again as well. That's the problem. This is what the problem that Khrushchev and Kennedy faced. They both faced their own military lobby, and they were both trying to wind it down. And it's one of the great tragedies. We come back to JFK again. It's one of the great tragedies of history that this pathetic piffle whereby LBJ's career ended up bumping off Kennedy just at the point when it was conceivable that the Cold War might have been seriously wound down. If Kennedy had got re-elected in 1964, Khrushchev had stayed in power, which he might have done. With Kennedy there, we might not have had the world as we have had it since 1964. And that is one of the great ironies, isn't it? Some small, these, gangsters in Texas, affected world history on a major scale without intending to particularly. Without the LBJ, you might never have had Cold War II, for example. With Jimmy, and all the Jimmy Carter period and all the rest of the Cold War, the help with frontiers in the 80s.
Yeah.
Yes, we come back to the old question, which is bedeviled. The people in the West looking at the Soviet Union and now Russia, which is, well, what are the Russians up to? Because my parents were in the Communist Party up to 1956. So I grew up in a world in which it was almost instinctive that the Soviets were on the side, were the good guys. It took me a long time to shed that, as well into my 20s before I got rid of that basic instinctive reaction, which was very common on the British left. The Soviets are the good guys and the Americans are the bad guys. I think to some extent you can justify that now. But can you interpret what Russia is doing? Can you interpret Russian foreign policy? I certainly can't. What we've got in Russia now, a sort of loose alliance of indigenous fascists, nationalists, nativists, the Russian church. You've got people who I read a book by the guy who last year was Putin's deputy. I've forgotten. He's written a lot of books. I read one. And their view is everything between 1917 and 1989 in Russian history was a disastrous mistake. So if you wipe all that out, what you got before 1917? Well, you've got Russian literature, and you've got the church, and that's all there is.
And the Russian Empire.
The Russian Empire. There is the Russian Empire, indeed, the old Russian Empire, about which I know very, very little. And this raises another bloody subject. This stuff is now so big, and there's so much information on the internet, you could just wander off down one of these little paths, and there it all is.
Yeah,
so
in terms of the Russian foreign policy, just superficially, it seems kind of self-evident that it's. I think most people in the West even can see this, that it's that their policy is to stand up to the West,
but cautiously.
Well, cautiously, because the Americans have got many more weapons than they have. But you can easily interpret Russian behavior in the last decade in particular, that Russia is apparently trying to recreate the old Russian Empire. It may not, that's what the American right wing says, and you can make a good case for that, and you can make a reasonable case for that. And this guy, this Russian deputy prime minister, whose book I read, he was certainly talking about stuff like that. Russia's faded glory.
Can you remember his name?
I'm not even sure I can find his book on my shelf. Well, you keep talking. I'll scan my shelf, see if I can see the bloody book.
Okay.
Of course, I'm sitting with I've got 3,000 books in this room, and I'm not sure where I filed that. I'm not even sure if I even kept it.
You need a librarian.
You can't keep all the books. You've got to I haven't got enough room for them. I can't remember his name. Anyway, but
you need a bigger house.
You can find the stuff on the internet easily.
Okay, I'll look at it.
The problem on the internet is, of course, is deciding whether the social reading is reliable. Because all websites look the same now. Once upon a time, serious stuff was well produced, well published, well bound, and you could tell it was a serious book just simply by the way it was produced. The stuff like My Little Pamphlets and Lobster magazine produced for no money, they look crappy. On the internet now, all websites look great. So the website itself doesn't give you any clues to its possible content.
No.
So it makes it more difficult, especially for beginners. I don't want to insult people, for God's sake. I've been doing this a long time. And I sometimes think, how would I fare today if I started today? And the answer is that I would be drowning like everybody else is. If I was 22. You know what I mean?
Yeah, just walking away. Yeah, I think people just walk away. There's such a overload of information.
It's too complex, yes. I mean, I got into this in 1976 when I got into the total number of books that were worth buying and collecting on, say, British parapolitics. I think there were 3 of them, maybe 4. And one magazine, State Research it was called, and there were odd articles in the text. Nowadays, there's a subject called intelligence, a university subject called the study of intelligence, and there are hundreds of books about MI5 now, hundreds of them. They're all about MI5 50 years ago, because they haven't opened the files any later than that, but 50 years ago takes you into the 50s. So the subject is now utterly unmanageable, preposterously unmanageable.
Let me just...
I was 22.
Yeah.
Go on.
I just wanted to bring up something that I'd like to try and challenge the idea. I mean, let me first ask you. You described the intelligence agents in the UK, MI5, MI6, or whatever, most of them as during the Cold War as being well-intentioned but misguided. Does that hold true for the same types today?
Today, my guess would be probably. Probably.
Okay.
I think there was a big. I think there was a big clearing out in the 80s when I think although there's been no official inquiries into the Wilson stuff, the Wilson period of the 70s, the plot thing. I'm pretty sure there was a big clear out in the 80s, and a lot of the old guard were pensioned off. I think there was a big clear out in MI6 after the Iraq War debacle. The 6 went along with all that nonsense, and they got it completely wrong. And I think if we had access to their personnel rosters, which we don't, but if we had access to their personnel, I think you'd find a lot of the people who were the most enthusiastic supporters of the Iraq War, and there weren't that many in 6, I don't think, have been got rid of. This happens. I mean, it's almost like a purge. If you're on the wrong side of history on something as big as that, then you get bumped. Not being bumped off, you get bumped off the list.
Or bumped off.
So my guess would be, I don't know, I currently do not know any intelligence officers or security officers or policemen. I simply don't meet them. They may be corresponding with me under pseudonyms I don't recognize, but I simply don't know what they're like. My impression from what I read is they're quite different now in some ways. Quite different.
So the reason I asked that question is because I've been trying, on and off to me, trying to find evidence of, I suppose what I would describe as conscious evil intent. And it's very hard to do because I recognize that there's an almost limitless ability amongst human beings to justify anything to themselves with under the guise of noble intentions. People can say that you have eggs to make an omelette, blah blah blah, all of these ideas.
where you can justify stuff to yourself, and ultimately you can't turn around and say that person consciously knew that they were doing evil and went ahead and did it. But, when I think about, for example, I can't remember her name, the old lady who was, it seems, was killed by some element of the British...
Hilda Morell.
Yeah.
Hilda Morell.
Ban the bomb, a CND, ban anti-nuclear weapons activist, an old lady who no danger to anybody, apparently, but apparently she was a danger to somebody that went and kind of brutally murdered her. Now, how do you justify that? What's the narrative?
Do we even know? Well, are we even sure what happened there?
No.
I'm certain what happened there. I mean, her nephew, Commander Rob Green, the New Zealand guy, his view, because he was a nuclear submarine during the Falklands War, his view, I think, is that MI5 or some section of the intelligence community got it into their heads that she might have been told by him something naughty about what was happening in the Falklands War. And there's something naughty, I think, we now know what the something naughty was, which was that Mrs. Thatcher threatened nukes on Argentina unless the French government gave them the means, the electronic codes, to disable the Exocet missiles. Because the Exocet missiles were starting to sink the British ships. The British came very close to losing that war. And the turning point was when the Argentine Exocet missiles, A, the French stopped supplying them, and B, they gave the British, as far as I can tell, this is true, they gave the British the means to disable them in transit. And I read a couple of occasions which seemed fairly reliable that Mrs. Thatcher said to Mitterrand, unless you give us the codes, we're going to use nukes on the Exocet base. At that point, Mitterrand gave her the nukes, gave her the codes. The nukes weren't used. Now, when you think to yourself, what secret in the Falklands War was serious enough that they wanted to suppress, that they would, go to the length of, breaking into an old lady's home in Shropshire. And it was probably that. Rob Green, I think, believes that Hilda Morell stumbled upon them doing a burglary, and they panicked and killed her. She was an old lady. It's not difficult to kill old ladies. They die quite easily, and it looks like a fumble. Right. And then, of course, they do a ridiculous cover-ups and all the usual nonsense then takes place. They go into a flap and they panic and they make things worse and they cover it up crudely and then they have to cover it up more thoroughly and so on and so on. I don't think anybody would justify, I can't imagine anybody in the security service is trying to justify the death of Hilda Morell in the national interest, except, no, that's not true. I could imagine somebody justifying it by saying, for something like this, if we think, Britain's greatness, which we must defend, depends upon the possession of nukes, then anything which is a threat to our possession of nukes must be opposed. And the idea that nukes were threatened, the use of nukes was threatened in Argentina might make the British people less enthusiastic about nukes. So, and you can see how the rationale goes on. It's what you said, there's an infinite capacity to argue that the ends justify the means.
And does the same apply to Dr. David Kelly then?
You know what happened? I have no idea what happened to Dr. David Kelly. Do you? I suspect he committed suicide personally.
Are you joking? Have you looked at the evidence?
Well, put it this way.
I mean, there's four top surgeons said about the cut in his wrist. Hogwash.
He would never have died from that.
No way.
I know.
And he had nothing in his stomach that was in any way an overdose of pills. The evidence that he had a heart monitor on him or something when they found him, and then the body was moved. I mean, it all points to somebody having bumped him off and botched it. But I mean, and obviously the rationale for it is that the guy was going to stand up and say, Mr. Blair, your evidence for weapons mass destruction in Iraq is complete and utter horseshit.
Yeah. You might be right, but I always think about it. I haven't read the Kelly stuff as closely as you have. I know I'm aware of a bunch of surgeons who have raised doubts about the evidence. But if you think that trying to commit suicide by cutting the vein on the front of your hand is a strange way to commit suicide, it's an even stranger way to fake a suicide.
I know. That's why it seems to be. That's what I don't get about it is how badly they did it. Because the kind of guys who the government would be able to say, go and do a job in this guy, they're usually not amateurs. They've done it before.
Why didn't they just slash his wrists a few times underneath his arms, like you would expect a suicide to look like?
Yeah.
And then they would all believe it then. But
Right.
He made this funny little cut on his wrist, on the top of his wrist, which didn't bleed very much. I don't know how difficult. Dr. David Kelly was 60. He wasn't very healthy. Blah blah blah. Who knows what it takes to kill an unhealthy 60-year-old man? I simply don't know. Would they think he was worth bumping off? I personally don't think it's likely. People like Kelly, all you have to do is threaten their pensions. That's how it works in Britain. Listen, old boy, you see any more, you lose your pension. Excuse me. That's what the Peter Wright story was about. They fucked up Peter Wright's pension. The man that wrote Spycatcher.
Right.
For your listeners who can't follow all this. The book they called The Great Storm in 1887. Peter Wright thought that his previous employment as a civil servant would be carried forward. Excuse me, my virus talking. Would be carried forward into his work with MI5, and he discovered that the previous years didn't count, so he got a piffling little pension. So he was really pissed off. So he thought, how can I make some money? I could write a book.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to threaten David Kelly, not to kill him, you have to say, listen, old boy, if you piss about any longer, your pension's in jeopardy. Or your daughter won't get into the university she wants to go to. Or we'll write stories in the media about your wife. You don't have to kill people in Britain to keep them quiet. And the mere fact is that the number of people that we could quote of examples of what might be political murders in Britain is tiny. With Kelly, there's that guy, the NSA guy found in the hold-all, whose name I've forgotten,
Right.
a few years ago.
Yeah.
There's that guy in Scotland. There's one guy in Scotland whose name I can't remember now, who was found by the roadside, who might have been shot. Now, having said that, because this excludes Northern Ireland,
Yeah.
there were thousands of political murders and hundreds caused by or tolerated by the British state. All these discussions always exclude Northern Ireland.
Yeah. Well, I think I've said it before. We had a show on the north. A guy on, and he. We kind of agreed that it was actually, I don't know if you know her. Got a couple of people on. The last one was Anne Cadwallader. She wrote a book just recently. She's a former BBC and RTE.
I reviewed her book.
Lethal Allies, and we kind of.
It was about the Glenanne or the Glenane gang.
Yeah. But we kind of agreed with her that Northern Ireland is the place to look in order to understand as much as you can of the nature of intelligence agencies in the West, let's say, when it was specifically British ones, but also in terms of trying to make sense of stuff that's going on in the world today by operations or wars or conflicts that Western governments or Western militaries are engaged in, and also stuff in the past. I mean, there's so much about Northern Ireland. I think it's matched in terms of its exposure of the worthiness of.
It's certainly in terms of British history. There's nothing like it.
But I want to just move on. I want to quote you something from your latest Lobster magazine. You obviously know what it is, or you'll know what it is. It was you're quoting a guy from a former boss agent, Gordon Winter. What is boss?
Gordon Winter.
What is BOSS?
Yeah, Bureau of State Security.
That's a British.
South African.
The
South African version of MI5 and MI6 rolled into one. Okay.
And he said that he quoted him from a BBC TV documentary about British security intelligence services. From Panorama in 1981. He said this. He said British intelligence has a saying that if there is a left-wing movement in Britain bigger than a football team, our man is the captain or the vice captain, and if not, he is the referee, and he can send any man off the field and call our man on at any time he likes. Basically, he's saying that the British intelligence have complete and utter control of any left-wing movement in Britain. This was in 81. But on the basis of that, what is your prognosis for Jeremy Corbyn if he's elected leader of the Labour Party?
Well, what we'd have to say about that, first of all, we shouldn't believe what MI5 say about themselves.
Right.
They're obviously not as good as that. They probably weren't as good as that. There weren't that many groups. There weren't that many groups involved. There was the CPGB, Communist Party, and then there were the various Trots, the Trots who were opposed to them, the Socialist Workers Party, International Marxist Group in the 70s, the Workers' Revolutionary Party. Those are the three big ones. So it wasn't, okay. And there's anti-apartheid. There was one-off campaigning groups like anti-apartheid and the Campaign for Colonial Freedom. Now, I think all that says is they were all infiltrated. And it's not difficult to infiltrate a left-wing group. All you have to do is join the fucking thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a famous story of Harry Newton, who was outed in the 80s. I wrote about him in Lobster. As a man who'd infiltrated the Institute of Workers' Control and the CND. Yeah, he went along to the CND and said, "Do you want any help?" And they said, "Sure. Can you put these envelopes, put these leaflets in this envelope, you could take over any group, any political group in Britain by volunteering to be the membership secretary, just doing the jobs nobody else wants to do." So that may not mean as much as it sounds. To come back, Corbyn really is. All that Corbyn shows you, it shows you two things. First of all, the notions of Tony Benn never went away in the Labour Party. Corbyn's a Bennite. If you want to understand Corbyn, read Tony Benn. That's the first part. The second part is, if you understand why he's popular, you have to start looking at the subgroups he's appealing to. He's proposing to have students. Without people can be students and get grants. That would be popular if I was a student. He's proposing that we don't have to have this austerity and we have to have cuts in welfare payments. If I was unemployed on sickness benefit or whatever, that'd be popular with me too. So it's not remotely surprising that he's popular. Whether or not the state is nervous about him, I doubt it very much. Because the only thing I think you could say for certain would be if the Labour Party elect Jeremy Corbyn as their leader, they will not win the next election because he will not pick up enough votes in the south of England to win the election. So the British establishment must be licking their lips at the thought of Corbyn as the leader. Laugh a minute. I mean, you get Corbyn in power, you've got the Tories in office for the next two terms. It's another 10 years, maybe 15 years. So the question might be, who's running Jeremy Corbyn?
The Tories.
You can ask these kinds of simple questions. If it's not what it looks like, what's really going on? Maybe Corbyn's working for something. I don't believe that for a minute. I've met Corbyn a long time ago. Corbyn is just what he looks like.
Maybe he's a Russian agent. I'm joking, but a lot of things have been said about political parties, opposition parties across Europe and the West in general, and the idea has been put out there that they're being funded by Russia.
Yeah, they're bringing
from Syriza to the right in France.
It's a Cold War playbook being opened again,
Well, I don't know. I haven't researched this. I don't know what's been written about Russia's support for political groups in the West. It wouldn't surprise me if they were doing it. That's how you play the great game. I mean, the Americans are subsidizing everybody everywhere who wants to oppose the Russians. All those color revolutions the Americans organized, the most recent is the coup in Ukraine. That's all, the NED stuff. That's all, that's how the Americans do it. If the Russians are doing the same thing, I wouldn't be remotely surprised. But they haven't got the financial resources to do it.
They haven't got the infiltration. I mean, the US and the British have, together they have a few hundred years of kind of networks across around the world.
Yeah, absolutely, and phone contacts and networks, absolutely. So for the Russians, it's very, very difficult. But there are some stories I've seen coming out of America about the Russians approaching various journalists and saying, "Would you please run this story?" and doing it in the very, very crass, very crude, run this story. We'll give you money. Really dumb. That's not how you do it. That's not how you do it at all. The Russians would have to have a much longer view of this and set up, fronts and foundations like Americans and all that stuff. And I haven't seen any evidence that they're doing it. They may be doing it, but I mean, who knows? Maybe they're. I don't know how smart the Russians are. I can't get any fix on how clever the people around Putin are. I don't know whether they're just a bunch of crude peasant gangsters that they sometimes appear. I really can't tell. The KGB certainly were a bunch of smart people by Soviet standards. The KGB We're the elite. But, I mean, when you read the stuff produced by some of their defectors since '89, it's not that impressive. They didn't have a terribly impressive grasp on world affairs, I don't think. So, I don't think the Russian state's capable of doing this in a clever enough way to make any difference. It's worried about imperialism in the modern world. It's America and China. I would have thought China is the one that's spending the money in the third world now.
Yeah. I just want to get a quick take. I don't know how long your answer will be, but what was your take on Scottish independence vote last year?
Well, I mean, what happened in Scotland was the biggest act of entry of them in history. Essentially, as far as I can understand it, the people that used to be the left wing of the Labour Party in Scotland basically all joined the Scottish National Party and took it over. So never mind the militant tendency in Liverpool in the 80s. I mean, the Labour left took over the SNP. Now, I've met a fair bit of the intellectual end of the SNP, and there's a lot of bright people up there. But it's very, very striking. In 2015, we're going to be nationalists. The N-word. I mean, I'm a nationalist. I'm an old-fashioned economic nationalist. I'm a lefty nationalist. There's only about 5 of us left in England. Outside the far right. I mean, the BNP and all the rest of it. But in Scotland, suddenly nationalism becomes respectable. I mean, when I was growing up in Edinburgh in the 60s, the SNP were a joke. I mean, they walked around wearing tartan and kilts, and people laughed at them. They were known as the tartan Tories. But then what happened in the 80s and 90s, which is basically the Labour left got so disgusted, as they would say in Scotland, so scunnered, so by the rightward drift of the Labour Party, they all joined the SNP, took it over and turned it into the left wing of the Labour Party. It's no wonder that the SNP say, we could work with Jeremy Corbyn. Of course you could. You used to be in the Labour Party.
Yeah. Go on.
Sorry, I couldn't say, but I've written in the current issue of Lobster, I don't know how up to date you are, I wrote in the current issue of Lobster about something that Madame Le Pen, the daughter of Le Pen, who runs the Front National in France, and his daughter, he's an old anti-Semite, and his daughter isn't, who now runs the party. His daughter's not anti-Semite, but she said, the big division these days is between globalization or nationalism. You're either a globalist or you're a nationalist. And I think, and she said it's left and right doesn't matter. I don't believe that. I think left and right still matters greatly, but it's certainly the case. You either support the globalization, the movement towards globalization, or you don't. Personally, I don't. I think it's a disaster. Destroy the planet. Quite manifestly, they will destroy the planet if they get a chance to. They are doing. Yeah. So and I say in this Lobster, I say, at that point, I am on the side of Madame Le Pen and from National. Now, there's hardly anybody in the British left who would say that. But there might be someone in the SNP who would say that. I don't know. They might find Le Pen embarrassing. I don't know. But certainly in terms of that big divide between globalization and nationalism, I'm a nationalist.
But given the landslide election results for the SNP, didn't it strike you as peculiar that a minority of those same SNP voters chose not to strike out for independence?
Do you mean, do I think they rigged the referendum?
Yes.
Well, there's some evidence that they rigged the 1975 referendum on the European Union. There's not much evidence, but there's the odd hint. There was quite a lot of chatter in Scotland after the referendum that the people that lost thought they'd been cheated in some way. I don't know how the referendum in Scotland was organised. I don't know how the count was done. In Britain, the count was done nationally. They did the vote count in Earl's Court in one big room. The whole goddamn thing was counted in one room. They completely ignored the existing, local government, national government election structure run by local authorities. It's all sitting there, and they bring out every year nowadays, have local elections, and then every 5 years they have a national election. It's an old piece of machinery. It works really well. For that one-off referendum, they had to count nationally in Earl's Court. And I said in Lobster a couple of years ago, the only reason I can think of for doing this would be if you wanted to rig it. Now, that's all the evidence there is. Do I think the British states willing and capable of rigging an election in Scotland on the referendum? Yes, of course they are. Of course they are. Whether it's technically possible, I don't know.
Yeah.
And all I can say is nobody's produced any good evidence yet that it was rigged.
Yeah.
It might have been. They're certainly capable of doing it on these really big key issues. Of course they are. The British state, as it's shown in Northern Ireland, is as ruthless as any other.
Exactly. And they would have had all the motive in the world to do it should they have wanted to.
Indeed.
I'd like to bring up something that I've got a feeling you were probably one of the few people to talk about back in the 80s. And I'm sure you took a lot of flack for it. This is pedophilia in high places. You must be feeling somewhat vindicated by the modern, recent revelations concerning stuff back then in particular.
Kincora et al.
Exactly.
Well, we never wrote... Lobster never published much about Kincora. We published a couple of wee pieces. Stephen Dorrell, with whom I co-founded the magazine before we fell out, but he wrote a piece very early on, Lobster 3, I think it was in 1984, about Kincora, which, at the time was as good as you could do it, and he got most of it wrong. But who knows? We were just cutting newspapers in those days and, reassembling bits from magazines and newspapers. Kincora, I think, is one of the really big things the British state wants to keep quiet. Because Kincora, you were talking about the idea of evil, the state doing evil things. If there is a good example of other than the state running killer gangs in Northern Ireland, if there's in the current climate, the fascination with child abuse, there is no sexier or more dangerous subject than the idea that MI5 tolerated the abuse of young men by, who knows, the rich and the famous, the bigwigs of the day. Who knows? There's nothing more dangerous to them than the idea that was tolerated in the again back to rationalising it in the pursuit of wider objectives, i.e., gaining intelligence on what the fraud groups were doing. Because that's what they will claim. We were running agents through Tara, from McGrath and his gang. We were running agents, and we had to let them carry on because they were producing valuable intelligence. That's what the rationalisation will be. Whether I believe that, I don't know. Lobster, truthfully, didn't publish much about Kincora. We publicised Wallace in 86, 85, 6, 7, 8, 9, I guess, with 5 years. I did about 5 years, more or less, on Wallace and his story. And he was the guy who tried to get the Kincora thing exposed. And it was the Kincora thing which killed his career and got him framed for manslaughter and all the rest of it. So that was sensitive then. It's even more sensitive now. As far as I can see, they're still trying to keep it quiet. They're trying to exclude Kincora from the big inquiry into child abuse in Britain and leave it in a little rigid inquiry in Northern Ireland, which won't have the same powers as the British inquiry. That's the latest. But that's that sort of state of play. How important the paedophile story will turn out to be I have no idea, truthfully. I really don't know. Wallace, I've talked to Wallace very recently. He says, yes, they were hearing in the 70s that people from Kincora and one or two other children's homes in Northern Ireland, the boys, this is not girls, this is homosexual pedophilia, the boys were being trafficked to England to be used for sex parties. Beyond that, he doesn't know, he's never heard, he doesn't know who was involved. There's no reliable sources on who were involved, to my knowledge. There's only one source, Richard Kerr, I think his name is, who's talking about it. To my knowledge, he hasn't identified anybody amongst the people who were abusing him. If we indeed believe him, I don't know whether we believe him or not. The problem nowadays is, look at Jimmy Savile, for example. These days, if you go along to the lawyers who are working for the Jimmy Savile victims and say, well, he abused me in Top of the Pop studio in 1973, they're going to say, okay, fine, money. That's all it takes. All you have to do is prove you were in the right vicinity and you will become a bona fide victim. There's no other criteria being used. And it's an Australian law firm who've taken over the job. they bought the British firm that was running the family estate, and they're going to empty the family estate of every penny, and it'll be divvied up minus the lawyers' big fees, of course, amongst hundreds of people for whom claim to be being abused by Savile. Some of whom will have been, lots of whom probably won't have been. They're just opportunists. You always get this, opportunists and fantasists, but basically opportunists. If you say to people, oh, if you've been abused, you'll get compensation, here come the people who claim they've been abused.
Yeah, I think just to answer my own question about the...
Yeah, do answer your own question. You can probably do better than me.
I was going to answer my own question about that idea of people creating a narrative, having this almost limitless ability to create a benevolent narrative for what officially or otherwise would be seen as a kind of evil deed. I think, obviously you can always find a way to excuse someone who's done something that is technically evil or officially evil by saying, well, he was misguided or his intentions were good. But I think that doesn't really apply. I think I can still label these people as evil because most people, when faced with that choice between, let's say, furthering the interests of the British state and killing someone who is effectively innocent, people would go for, well, screw the British state, I'm not going to kill someone. So people who make the choice for killing someone in the interest of some broad kind of interest of the British state or progress of or the interest of the British government or whatever, I mean, those people are evil. That's a moral line that they have crossed there that puts them in a category of people that makes them very different, I think, from the ordinary person in the street who would say, no, I'm going to draw the line at killing someone who doesn't deserve to be killed, who has done nothing wrong. I'm not going to use this person and use their death and misrepresent their death in the interest of some kind of airy-fairy, intangible almost kind of benefit to the state. I mean, that for me, that doesn't fly. I mean, because I'm kind of undercutting my own argument because I try to look at things in two ways, and I try and say, well, how can I understand the justification for what these people have done? But at the same time, I'm not willing to take that so far where I would excuse them for acts of murder in the interest of something stupid, really.
Well, all right, let's do. I mean, I'm going to have to stop fairly soon because I'm losing my voice here. But let's go back to the idea of killing an innocent person. You end up with a kind of moral calculus, and it's not. These people aren't the man or woman in the street. These are people engaged in long, complicated operations. For example, the best example I can think of off the top of my head is it is now widely reported. I don't know whether it's true or not. It is now widely reported, or has been widely reported, that Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness made some kind of approach to the British state quite a long time ago, maybe early 80s, 83, 84. They could see the writing on the wall. They could see that the war wouldn't win. And they approached maybe that man, which is named Alan, who was the MI6 guy who was sniffing around in Northern Ireland. They approached some 6 guys through an intermediary and said, listen, guys, we know the war can't be won, and so we have to move towards some kind of peace deal. In these situations, there's always somebody who does that. Jomo Kenyatta and Kenya. There's always somebody who ends up as the transitional figure who moves from being terrorist to politician. Now, in the reports I've seen, it's quite frequently stated that this was done. These moves were made, and the British state then began clearing the path for Adams and McGuinness, and that probably involved killing people or letting people be killed. Mm-hmm. In other words, you start editing, start filtering out the IRA leadership to make sure that Adams and McGuinness have no opposition. Now, in terms of moral calculus, what's three or four dead Irishmen compared to 200 dead Irishmen? Yeah. That's the problem with the moral calculus stuff, or the utilitarian argument. Yeah. And the people who are engaged in this stuff often end up having to make these decisions. Yes, this guy doesn't deserve to die, but his death will further our cause quite greatly, and sometimes, very, very greatly, very, very greatly indeed. And so I'm glad I'm not having to make those decisions. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it at all. I mean, God Almighty, just putting out an issue of Lobster used to give me the shits. I used to be the most terrible, the deadline approached. My colon would go into the spasms and I'd be shitting blood. I couldn't handle big agents for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
The stress would have killed me.
Yeah.
So these are strange people. I don't know how you do this stuff, but some people do it. And I'm sure they would always in the end have a rationalization for what they did. They would produce some calculus, some model, some calculation. You say, well, look, I did X, but it had good consequences. And if I hadn't done X, it would have had very, very bad consequences. But, and it's not difficult to see how this works.
But evil is done no matter what their rationale. I mean, I can go back to the Nuremberg trials and what's his face sitting there in front of the camera is justifying, what's his name? At the Nuremberg trials, the guy, the German.
Hess. Which one? The one
that they made a film about it. They made a film about it, and
are you thinking of Eichmann?
Eichmann.
He came later.
Eichmann later,
yeah. In
Israel, yeah.
He was tried in Israel, yeah.
That's right, yeah. Given these banal kind of reasons for what he did, and I mean, I think you can excuse the person, but also say that evil was done.
Evil was done. I think that you can say that. I mean, Eichmann's probably not a very good... Well, again, go back and look at the Nazis, people in the grip of theories. I mean, they all lots of them, at the higher level of the SS and the Hitler's regime, they all seem to have genuinely believed that theory about the Jews, how it was corrupting American society, blah, blah, blah. They really believed that shit.
Yeah.
And the modern equivalent, I guess, the people that take the Quran literally, or the bits of the Quran that suit them, take it literally and think they have some ethical, moral reason to kill the non-believers. It's people in the grip of theories are terribly dangerous people, which is, I guess, one of the things Lobster's tried to do. If I've tried to do anything, is tiptoe through the theories, picking my way through the theories if I could, and not, adopt. Here's the line. Lobster never really had a line. Except Lobster only had methodological line. If you're going to say it, where's the footnote? Show me the evidence. Which, of course, is the Internet, because the Internet is covered in stuff and there's no evidence for most of it. In these kind of fields, anyway.
Yeah.
That's the problem with it. This is why, and again, we come back to what I said earlier. If I was 20 years old looking at all this stuff, how would you sort out the shit from the shit over? I have no idea. I don't know.
Yeah.
The Internet is a very odd phenomenon and may, in the long run, prove to be fantastically dangerous to human beings.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastically dangerous.
It already is. It already is. What people use it for.
Well, I mean, most human beings on the planet are not intellectually equipped to handle large quantities of data of any kind, let alone political data, let alone religious political data, in any sensible way. And yet, they have, 2 clicks away. Here you go. Any nonsense in the world, and it no longer has an official stamp of nonsense. This is very, very striking. This has never happened in human history before, because there used to be an academy of one kind or another which stamped nonsense on things. Most recently, it was the universities, the higher media, the government, the BBC. They would arbitrate between nonsense and not nonsense, and that's all gone now. It's all gone. And I don't know where this is going to take us. I really don't know.
I suppose we'll find out one way or another.
If I live long enough, I'm 67, guys. I mean, I'm not going to live that much longer. The Internet's just getting started.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it'll all go pear-shaped long before you slip off the mortal coil.
That might be the case. I mean, I was part of the first green wave in 1969-70 when we thought the world was going to come to an end, and there was pollution and overpopulation and all the rest of it. Yeah. And it hasn't yet. But most of the things that are being predicted now about the population rising and the seas polluted and the air polluted and the soil polluted, this was all being talked about in the late 60s. And not because nobody took any notice at the time, because you just flipped by a new car, still nothing's being done about it. I mean, I don't know what it will take. We're straying off topic, I'm sorry.
No,
I kept thinking, what single event will it take to persuade people to do something about CO2 emissions, for example? I don't know, Venice sinks into the sea. I don't know. I mean, the town I live in, Hull, we're at sea level. If the water rises 10 inches, most of the city vanishes.
You're moving back to Scotland?
Yeah, I'll move up the hill. Move up the nearest hill.
All right, listen, Robin.
Guys, I'm going to have to stop my
Yeah, absolutely. Don't want to keep you, and I know you're not feeling the best, and I hope you get better soon. I hope we get kicked that whatever it is that's bothering you.
Oh, man, I think this virus is forever.
Well, hopefully not. But listen, I just want to thank you for being on and commend you for your work in Lobster. I mean, you're one of the few people who've been doing this day in, day out almost for several decades. There's not many.
Well, there's Bill Bloom. I know you had Bill Bloom on. Emil Blooms. I mean, he's significant work that I haven't written much at the book tonight, but he's one of the people I identified with. Bill's been banging away, for as long as I have. God bless him.
But it's that persistence that is pretty rare, and you have it,
well,
And I just want to tell people, just want to say to our listeners as well that they need to check out your website, lobster-magazine.co.uk.
Just put in, go to Google, put Lobster Magazine, you'll find it.
And sign up. I'm going to sign up. A lot of it's for free, but I'm going to sign up for a subscription because you get the goodies, don't you?
Well,
wink, wink.
The way it works is it's all the kind of stuff's all free. If you want to look at the older stuff before issue 56, I think it is, you can buy a CD-ROM with it all on, or I think you can pay out of £5 a week or something for a week. You can run me through it for a week for almost nothing. The little bits of money people pay for the website. Nobody's ever made any money out of it. Yeah,
it's for a very good cause. Very good cause anyway. So that's what I'm telling our listeners to.
Good cause. Thank you guys. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Take care. Thanks for having me on. Take care of yourself.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Robin's a good guy, and he's been doing it, like we said, for a long time. There's a show, I don't know if anybody is interested in it. It's maybe not interesting to a wide audience. It's quite particular. It's called Intelligence Services, and it's on YouTube, and it's on a show that used to air on British TV Channel 4. And it started at midnight every night, and it was basically famous people from different disciplines, and usually one member of the public as well. And they'd sit there around a table at night from midnight for about 3 hours usually. And they would talk about a particular topic, and they discussed some edgy topics. And he was on that show in 1986 or 7, I think, on intelligence services. And they had a politician, Merlin Rees, who's a scumbag. He's dead now, so I can call him that. And a few other private investigator and a few other guys who were former British intelligence agents. And then Robin sitting there who had all the dirt on all these people, And there's an interesting conversation from that point of view, There's some, like what I was trying to say to him in the show was, at least historically, British intelligence agents come from Oxford and Cambridge and Eton. They're old colonial family boys type thing, and there's a very strong current of racism running amongst them, and elitism, and that's not good in terms of their dealings with people that they deem to be lesser peoples. That's a recipe for trouble, But it's also true to a certain extent. And I didn't want to push Robin on this because he's not feeling well and would have taken too long. But he mentioned that in talking about the internet, the vast majority of people in this world are not capable for digesting a massive amount of complex information and trying to make sense of it, which is true. And most people, and the truth of that is seen by most people staying well away from anything that would force them to consider complex information as it hurts their brains, and they don't want to do it, and they just busy themselves with normal things, normal life. And that is true, and I think that's a kind of empirically true. It's true from a species perspective, of the human race. And but that then also opens up the idea, which it seems to be also equally true, is that there are certain people who can do that, who can absorb complex information and deal with the big questions, and they're the ones who should be the leaders of these people, the vast, the great unwashed, the masses who don't want to look at that information. So that seems to be almost a default written into the code, the base code of humanity,
of the matrix
of human life on Earth, is that there is always going to be a hierarchy. And if it's a small community, there's going to be kind of leaders or elders. You bring it out to multi-million, tens of millions of people in a country, there's going to be leaders. So
yes, the program allows for the leadership being of sound mind or deviant.
Well, the problem is that it should be of sound mind for the world to be a nice place to live in. That kind of prime directive almost, where it's written into that code kind of thing, where any human life, any human society on planet Earth is going to have that kind of hierarchy, where people take control. There are certain leaders, controllers, whatever. The people who argue against that, anarchists and different types of people who want to just level everything. This was an accusation thrown at the communists as well. You know what I mean? That was totally wrong-headed and anti, kind of anti-human nature, effectively. That you couldn't have the rule of the working man type thing of the proletariat, you know, because those people are the people who just want to go and do their daily job and don't want to be bothered with the complex questions of how to run a country,
finance, and international relations,
figure it all out, right? So that seems to be true, you know. So anarchists and those kind of communistic ideas aren't going to work, or are never going to work. But the other end of the scale is where you have people who rise into those or take those positions of leadership or power, and are fundamentally unempathic or have very little empathy for other human beings. People who assume those positions of leadership, by definition, need to have quite a strong, along with their strong leadership skills, they need to have strong empathic abilities and a strong sense of caring for the people over whom they are kind of ruling or governing or taking decisions for, you know. And you'd think that it would go with the two, because both of them would go together, because a person who has the abilities to rule should also understand the reason or the difference between him or her and the people below him, let's say below in quotes, that they do need a guardian. So there should be a natural, benevolent attitude and feeling towards those people. And in that scenario, it all works very well. It's like a parent-child relationship to a certain extent. The problem is when you've got people who are psychologically deviant in that way and effectively not really human in the normal sense of the word, and have have psychological issues that aren't apparent in the normal way. They don't look crazy and stuff, but they're effectively, here obviously we're talking about the idea of psychopaths and stuff, and when you get that kind of situation, it's horrible. You get massive abuse, you get parents of a child who are abusive to the child, and I think that's what we have today, and that's the major problem. But it seems, like you said, it's also written into the code of this matrix or this system where that is allowed for, and that can happen.
Yeah.
And
as hard as it is to believe, given how far we are into one version of that, there were times, and there are apparently pockets on the planet where the code is still aligned, working in the other direction. I mean, I'm thinking of in the East, Russia and China. I don't know how. Yeah, so this opens it up. This opens it all up beyond issues of ideology, issues of foundational beliefs that govern a whole country like America's manifest destiny. This opens it up beyond ethnicity. And it opens it up beyond genetics, because nothing is determined. And ultimately, everything in this world, the complex information we're talking about, is all coming through all of us. And as such, it is not inherent to any of us. What can you say? What can you say from that? It means that there is enormous potential for development growth, even as hard as it is to see any of that in the world today. It's so contractile. It's so the forces at work that we are visible and tangible to people are so rapacious.
Well, if the goal but we can assume the goal built into the system here on planet Earth, involving the human population, is for them to learn, to grow and learn about the worlds and all the different experiences and everything that can manifest in this planet. People should ultimately, or in theory, get to understand how it all works. If the way that we have posited is how the world works, that there's this hierarchical structure that's natural, but it can be, you can have benevolent leaders or you can have evil leaders. Well, that is something that people need to understand. People need to understand that about the system. If people only grew up in a society where they had benevolent leaders, you'd have people with a rather naive view of the world, and they would be quite vulnerable to being exploited if they moved to, like, say, another society or whatever in the world where there was a selfish, evil leader. So in that sense, it all serves learning, and it's necessary. Even these evil leaders provide very useful, important, and essential even learning opportunities for the people on the planet who are all the 99% or whatever you want to call them. These are all experiences that are provided by this evil leadership about the nature of the world. Mm-hmm. It's not pleasant, but how else are they going to learn that that's the nature of the world? So it's not something that you can change or should change, because those are the default settings of this planet. That seems to be the case. That's just a kind of fairly objective, I think, observation of, on a broad scale, of the conditions on this planet. And the idea of people wanting to change it, turning it into some kind of a utopia, misses the point, you know? I mean, you could even take an example of someone you know who had quite a hard upbringing from maybe somewhat abusive parents, not to the point that they were turned crazy or whatever, but compare that kind of a person to someone who had an idyllic upbringing. And you can see that there's a lot of differences between those two kind of people and their worldview. But at the very least, each of them have I've learned valuable things about the world from a idyllic upbringing and an abusive upbringing. And you could even say that the people who are brought up in a somewhat abusive family environment are, to a certain extent, stronger people. They've been kind of, tested, I suppose, or had some kind of resolve, or that can have a negative side as well. But certainly people in an idyllic environment where they never had any, never saw any violence, or never were treated badly, were always treated perfectly as wonderful, perfect little children, they have a lot of feelings in a certain sense as a result of that upbringing, or can have. So there's no way to say that. I'm just trying to say here that it's,
utopia sucks because you can't grow from it.
Yeah, that's maybe the short version.
Big extraction.
It would suck. It does certainly suck as equipping, in terms of equipping people with tools that they need to live in this world, to live successfully and not be exploited in this world. You need to know about violence and suffering and difficulty, because that's the nature of this world. You need to know how to survive that. To survive in this world, you need to have learned some or had some experience of suffering and survived it to equip you to do it, because there's people who for whatever reason had no suffering as they were brought up in a perfect childhood, and go out in the world, and the first thing that comes along to shock them, or some first bit of suffering they experience, they kind of fall apart, as an adult, So, yeah, it all sucks. So I'm not saying it doesn't suck. It all sucks, just in case anybody wonders.
Do we have any other items we want to discuss today?
I don't know. I don't think there's much has happened. There's obviously the China thing that happened this week.
Kaboom.
Kaboom splat. That bears, what was it? I think it's sodium cyanide. 700 tons of sodium cyanide is what they're saying. Sodium cyanide is obviously a version of cyanide, which is a poison. About a quarter of a gram of it will kill you. And 700 tons of it blew up, or at least a part of 700 tons of it blew up on that harbour. They
were planning to put it in ships and send it to America. It was a plot,
It was
wasn't
a
it?
plot, a Chinese plot to kill all Americans.
But the
Although
CIA saved
700
the day.
tons was far too much.
No, I'm joking.
Yeah. No, apparently that was 10 times more the maximum limit for that amount of sodium cyanide at that, stocked anywhere in China was 70 tons, and they had 700. Of course, they're looking here for reasons why
It was
it
so
went kaboom.
combustible.
But I'm sure that wasn't the first time that they had stocked 700 tons of a kind of dangerous chemical in that port. China stocks large quantities, as you can imagine, of all sorts of things. So the question remains, why did it blow up? And I don't think you can just say, oh, it was too much of that, when more than likely the same amounts have been stored many times previously. It reminded us of the West Texas, not West Texas, but a town called West in Texas. Last year, I think, was it last year?
No.
2 years ago?
2013.
2 years ago, where a fertilizer plant blew up that was storing ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate was also stored at this port, so I'm not sure about the cyanide thing. That's what they're saying, sodium cyanide, but ammonium nitrate was stored also at the port in China. So there seems to be, well, when we look at this explosion, when we look at the Texas explosion, the fertilizer plant where they were storing ammonium nitrate, we kind of at the time had the idea that it was maybe some kind of a space rock flew down and blew it up, because there were some little signs of flashes here and there that could have been something else. Other people have said something similar. But there have been a lot of different kind of explosions and booms and sinkholes around the world over the past few years that are all suggesting that there's something going on under the planet, and also there's something going on in the skies. So we're leaving it open at this point that this kind of, I think it's fair to say, it's an anomalous explosion in the Chinese port.
Yeah, it was extremely powerful blast.
It was unusual, and it was extremely powerful, and also unusual because I don't think they've had any explosions at that port before. It's not something, and I don't think I can remember
other chemical factories have exploded in China in recent years.
Yeah,
maybe not in that fashion though.
Right. So it's unusual, but I suppose when anything like that blows up so spectacularly, and I mean, there's over 100 people dead now, and it's amazing that it happened where it happened, in a port in the middle of the night that would have been relatively sparsely populated with people in the middle of the night, and also you don't have people in the port area, you don't have residential housing right there. If it had
they were fairly close by though. There were towers.
Yeah, there were, yeah,
apartments.
But given the size of it, 21 tons of TNT, they said equivalent, and about 500 meter radius. Pretty much everything was devastated. If that kind of thing had happened downtown, anywhere or closer in a populated area, you'd have thousands and thousands of people dead. And especially in China, where the cities are very densely populated. Tianjin has 15 million people.
For what it's worth, the name of the city means heavenly ford.
Yeah, not so heavenly these past few days. Yeah, so
it could be
one to watch. Chemical plants are one to watch for explosions.
Yeah, there seems to be a natural cause. Well, unnatural in the sense that it's relatively novel.
Yeah,
it's not normal for this to happen.
No,
out of the blue.
No,
but natural in the sense that something's at play. In this case, probably in the ground.
Yeah.
3 days prior, an entire metro station in another Chinese city just was eaten up by the earth, killing a man.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, they're unlikely to give out any information that would show anything other than an accident.
Worse than that, they're unlikely to have any idea that it could have been anything other than an accident.
But if they do come across it as part of an investigation,
when there was a massive explosion in Brooklyn, I think, last year. Do you remember CCTV video where
said it was
guys walking down the street and a gas explosion obliterated two blocks, not 2 blocks, but 2 apartment buildings on a block. And casual reports, I mean, they didn't try to cover anything up. they just noted that there was a sinkhole in front of it that appeared at the same time, unrelated. It wasn't like the center of the blast or anything. It was a sinkhole. And in addition, they also reported later that there were unusually high readings of methane gas in the area, unrelated to actual gas being piped through the buildings.
Right.
So,
yeah, it's strange. I mean, there's so many, at this point, with what the Earth seems to be doing, there's so many ways that you could, or so many possibilities for these kind of explosions and things to happen that are a function of that kind of opening up, or whatever you want to call it, of the Earth, the way you have sinkholes everywhere and gas leakings and just weird things. Like, I mean, when you talk about that event on a beach a couple of months ago in somewhere in
Rhode Island,
yeah, where there was an explosion just on a clean beach out of the sand. Apparently, a loud explosion occurred. No flame or anything like that, but it blew one woman who was right beside it 10 feet in the air. I mean, when you have to consider that, you know, mysterious, invisible explosions that leave no trace of any burning, no debris, nothing, just a loud bang that blows people away, blows people up in the air. And then you see explosions like this in China. Well, I mean, it's anybody's guess. This appears to be a science, a natural earth science that is has been previously unknown. Really, you know, this is science, you know, where the ground can just suddenly blow up without actually blowing up.
Indeed. Well, there's another instance, this string of what I call crater holes appearing in Russia, particularly in the north, in Siberia, Yamal, where the ground seems to, something detonates like a pocket of gas. And not just in any kind of random way. It seems to happen in such a way to form these perfectly cookie cutter holes that leave a crater rim around the side, scorch marks on the side of this chasm. What the hell are they? They suspect the only connection they've made with anything else that's known is that there may be similar type holes that formed in that identical height. They're identical, but they formed thousands of years ago. That they're associated with the previous ice age. So
it's evidence of a new ice age.
Exactly.
Ergo. Well, yeah, I don't know. Just have to keep watching people. That's all it's about. I mean, it's not so much figuring out as watching what goes on. It may all become clear after a period of time when everybody's dead, maybe. But in the meantime, there's crazy stuff going on and stuff that hasn't been seen, certainly in anybody's lifetime, and certainly probably in modern history. It's not recorded anywhere. There seems to be stuff happening on the planet, in the planet, and above the planet that is highly unusual.
Yeah, there's rainfall happening now that no one alive today has ever seen.
Right.
When a meteor can fall on a place that's bone dry in days.
Yeah,
no one alive has any conception of that until they see it.
Yeah.
There's no records, there's no science to explain it.
Yeah.
Well, we've given it a good try, but...
Well, they make up science as they go along, of course.
Yeah.
And then tell you that they knew about this all along. But it's in our latest edition of the science book that we published the day after it happened.
Yeah, I often go, when someone refers me to a Wikipedia page, I go to it and say, oh, I see. They're called frost quakes, are they? And you look at when the page was created, 2 weeks old.
Yeah, exactly. Frost quakes. Anyway, thanks to our listeners and thanks to... I think we're going to leave it there for this week, folks. And to our chatters, who are all having lots of fun, I think. We'll be back next week with another show. Same time, same place. Till then, have a good one.
See you next week. Bye-bye.